being chair, I'm going to exercise my privilege and speak first and make a couple of observations. One of the things that comes through in the play is that it happens whilst people do other things. It's easily forgotten. It's not noticed, and it's not when it's easily forgotten. I think plays like this bring the past vividly into the present. And I think that's an important part of what has followed after the war. So I'm going to make a couple of comments about the story and what today's discussion might be about, and then I'll let Anne speak and then Francis speak. And then we will have a couple of people who have experience of it themselves to also speak, and we'll take your questions. It's of course a story in the context of war. But the problem with thinking about what has happened as something that happens in war is that you miss the fact that it happened before the war and it happens after. That Tamils are targeted because of their ethnicity by state violence. Right? So the kind of logic that allows the state to bomb and kill large numbers of civilians because of their ethnicity continues afterwards in a more mundane and routine and everyday manner as kind of state violence. And it's a form of governance also. And I think that's important because what has happened after the war is that the survivors were tortured and raped and abused, and their families were tortured and raped and abused. And when they fled abroad, their family members who stayed behind were tortured and abused. And that goes on. So this is not something peculiar to the moment or the regime, but has been part of how Sri Lanka does things, how Sri Lanka governs. I think that's important because there's a tendency, and particularly now in international assumption, that these horrors happened during the war. No, they happen all the time. They were intense during the war. That's my first point. The second point, and this is, if I had to make a criticism, there has to be criticism. A small criticism is the title is something that we should think about, the island nation. The fact that a population lives in a piece of territory does not constitute a nation. In this country, you can ask the Scots that. I think that to presume a nation must presume a kind of cohesiveness or unity before you can call it a nation. Whereas in Sri Lanka, there's always been one particular nation that's been legitimate in the country, and that's the Sinhala majority. The flags that you saw today, the state itself is geared around that identity. Everybody else is there at the whim of that identity. And that struggle means that there have always been two nations. And this is at the heart. It'll never go away. It'll never go away. The moment you refer to any of these people who went through all of that as Sri Lankans, you have denied their very existence as an identity. Right? Genocide is not just about killing people. It's about calling them something other than what they're not. So that's a small criticism. It's gone on a bit longer than I wanted to. So I want to ask Hannah from Torture to say some things about the kind of things that have happened afterwards. So what is happening in our present?
Okay, so I'll start just by talking a little bit about who we are, who Freedom from Torture are, and what it is that we do, so you can understand sort of how we do our research and the work that we've done on torture in Sri Lanka since 2009. So we're one of the largest torture rehabilitation charities in the world, and we're the only organisation in the UK that's solely focused on the rehabilitation of torture survivors. And we were set up about 30 years ago, and since then around 57,000 torture survivors have been referred to us for treatment. And sadly, Sri Lanka has been our top country of referral for the last 4 years. We've been involved in kind of Sri Lankan issues and had huge numbers of Sri Lankan clients. I realised that having had the criticism of calling people Sri Lankan, I'm now falling into that trap myself. But I'll explain why I'm kind of using that in just a second. I've lost my track now of where I was, but so we have had large numbers of Sri Lankan clients for decades, and so particularly after the conflict, we were in a situation where there was this assumption that with the end of violence, that torture would stop, and that the number of clients that Freedom from Torture would see from Sri Lanka would drop. And there's still this assumption that the numbers must be going down. And that just hasn't proven to be the case at all. So last year, we published a report called Tainted Peace, and that looked at the medical evidence that we had of torture. Part of one of the services that we provide is that we forensically document torture in order to help people's asylum claims. And we do that to kind of UN standards. We use the Istanbul Protocol to kind of forensically document torture. So it's a kind of very robust forensic process. And Tainted Peace looked at 148 cases of torture, and that's just such a small drop in the ocean. So that's 148 cases where people had fled the country, made it to the UK, made it through that ordeal, and then been referred to us and been accepted, because we have huge amounts of more demand on our time than we have capacity. So I tried to think what the real number of cases really is. I mean, it's sort of unimaginable numbers. And part of the reason why I kind of accidentally, but now I'm going to pretend that it was deliberately, said Sri Lankans rather than Tamils, is although the vast majority of our Sri Lankan clients are Tamil, we do have numbers of Sinhalese clients who come through who were caught up in the violence and then kind of also accused of being LTTE or Tamil Tiger sympathisers, and treated in the same way by the state. And we're quite keen to say this sort of violence ends up always being indiscriminate in a lot of ways, because when you cast your net so widely in the name of security and counter-terrorism and kind of securing your state, it's impossible not to kind of catch people who maybe kind of are outside the expectation of who might be targeted for torture. And so Tainted Peace kind of did this analysis of 148 cases, and then we got into a long and I think quite surprising fight about a bit similar to that you saw in the play, with the arguments about the numbers and what's your methodology around whether or not our evidence is credible evidence, and whether or not, how do we know who the people are that we're seeing, and that they haven't inflicted this torture on themselves just to get asylum in the UK. And you can imagine, in the kind of context of the asylum system in the UK, that's a popular argument among some elements of the UK population. And so we kind of were in a situation for a long time where we were kind of arguing that torture was still happening, and kind of hitting a bit of a brick wall about it's not still happening, it's a new government, it's the conflict's over, torture's not happening. And particularly after the elections in 2015 and the election of President Sirisena, then there was a whole move to say actually there was torture, there was a little bit of torture, but it happened under the last government, and now it's a new government and there's no problem. And so we carried on monitoring, and of course we are now getting cases from 2015, and I'm sure we will get cases from 2016. There's always a delay because of the amount of time it takes people to flee the country and make their way to us. And so now we've started kind of reporting on 2015 cases, and trying to use that to advocate to say that you can see a very clear pattern, the patterns of torture, there's beating, burning, rape, but all the things that you can read about kind of anywhere. That's still the pattern. The end of the conflict does not equal a sort of instant, overnight dismantling of a security structure that has become completely used to using this as a legitimate way of securing areas or trying to control a population. And so we found it very helpful that this year, finally, after much lobbying and campaigning by various groups, including us and Francis, for a UN visit by the Special Rapporteur for Torture to Sri Lanka, he released some preliminary findings in May that said torture is widespread, it exists in a culture of total impunity, and that impunity is for the crimes that happened during the conflict in the 2009 period, and then continues, as you know, it doesn't take a huge imagination to picture. And so we're now in a position where, you know, I think, you know, as you alluded to, the attention has gone off the situation in Sri Lanka. It's not top of the news cycle. There's, you know, it's now, I have to do some hasty math, 7 years since the conflict officially ended. It's just not in people's consciousness, and there is an assumption that the problems of the conflict are solved. Everyone knows someone who's been to Sri Lanka. It's very beautiful, as they said on the film at the start, you know, kind of what a great honeymoon destination, and it is all of those things, but there's still a huge amount that needs to be done in order to dismantle the types of state structures that perpetuate an issue like torture. And we do a huge amount of advocacy in kind of the UN and various other kind of international fields, as well as with kind of bilateral governments, about what does your torture prevention programme look like as part of your engagement with Sri Lanka. And I have to say, it's incredibly difficult to get a clear picture on what torture prevention programmes do look like. And it's a very frightening situation that while trade and you know, kind of is being promoted, and you have, you know, Sri Lanka kind of going into EU discussions about trying to regain trade preferences, that, you know, that's happening against a backdrop of continuing human rights violations. So I'm making myself quite depressed at this point, but it's a kind of continuous thing, and I think, you know, plays like this are absolutely essential for reminding people of what happened, the length of time that it happened over, and we can't be naive about how long it takes to rectify the issues, or even begin to rectify the issues. That's assuming you even have political will, and I think that's probably a question for huge debate, and you know, to tackle those things. And at the moment, I have to say, I don't see a huge amount of political will to really tackle the issue of impunity or take any action that would have a significant impact in halting security sector, police, you know, intelligence agencies, kind of a routine use of torture. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay.
So I probably should explain a bit about who I am. I was the BBC's correspondent in Sri Lanka during the peace process period, and obviously knew many of the characters in the play quite well. Anton Balasingham and Eric Solheim, the two negotiators, and the president at the time, Chandrika Kumaratunga. So that was a period when I kind of went to the peace talks, covered it, and so on. At the end of the war, I wrote a book of survivors' stories, people who'd managed to escape Sri Lanka, who were in different countries, you know, Ireland, Germany, France, England, Australia, all sorts of places. And I wrote their stories, and I have to admit, the first woman I went to interview, I probably over-interviewed her because I was so shocked by her story. And then I realised actually that everybody who survived that war had the most extraordinary story of escape and survival against the odds. And when you look at this play, I mean, obviously there are bits of it that are, you know, very redolent of my book and quite difficult to watch because I know the real events or the real people that they're based on, as do many of the people in this room. So, for example, the point when the UN convoy is attacked, I mean, that's a real incident towards the end of January. It's known as Convoy 11, and it was well documented, and there are survivors from the UN and Tamils who witnessed it, who are in the UK, who saw that, and it's one of the kind of the point of the war really where it escalated in a very extreme way. The whole issue of, well, one of the UN people is sort of based on someone we know but a different gender and sort of amalgamated, and the character of Jenny is an amalgam of different real people in a way. And this whole business of collecting the casualty data, that's all absolutely accurate, that's what happened, and we know the person that did that and the frustrations they had in trying to get that information out, and it was leaked. And a lot of the information about the UN later emerged in a leaked internal investigation that Ban Ki-moon ordered into the UN, known as the Charles Petrie report. And that was actually quite devastating in terms of looking at what happened with the UN in Sri Lanka, and it put it in a continuum from Rwanda onwards, talking about the UN's grave failures to protect people. I think, you know, there are serious questions for the United Nations about how it behaved in Sri Lanka and whether it's learnt those lessons. And actually what happened in Sri Lanka sparked what's called the Rights Upfront movement in the UN, which is supposed to put human rights, right at the centre of policy. And I think that's still a huge struggle within the United Nations. And certainly, you could ask questions about how that's done in Sri Lanka today, and that's clearly not really what's happening. There've been a number. If you talk about the death toll, the UN panel, which is referred to, talked about 40,000 dead. But this figure could be much larger. The UN internal inquiry talked about 70,000 people dying, and this is being killed, and in 5 months, 6 months, in the minute space and territory. And it's quite possible that more than that, 100,000 or more, were killed in that period. We just don't know to the nearest 10,000, which is quite shocking, really, when you think about it. After writing my book, I got sort of involved in documenting torture and sexual violence. I made a documentary about sexual violence, and I work now with a group of lawyers, former UN investigators, and run them, and we basically collect evidence complementing what our colleagues from Freedom from Torture do. They do it from a medical perspective, we do it from a more legal perspective, and taking several days, taking testimony and matching testimony, showing people photographs, trying to identify perpetrators and that kind of thing. So the scene of the woman who's in the hood on the floor, being basically in a torture cell, is basically my everyday life, what I document and read, unfortunately, and many of the immigration lawyers here also deal with that on a daily basis. I have to say, though, there's a lot for me to talk about, but I really am conscious that there are at least 2 people here who were in the island, shall we say, at the end of the war, one of them in Navani and one of them in Colombo, and I think that I feel uncomfortable speaking for them, and I'd like them to speak for themselves, and I think they've agreed to do that. So maybe in a mixture of English and Tamil, I'm not sure, so please go ahead.
So what I'm going to ask is for people to ask questions. Think about a question, and if you put your hand up, I'll pick you. I'm going to say this now. Don't make speeches, please. Just ask a straight question. If you make a speech, I'll just stop you. Don't be offended. I wouldn't care. Go ahead. First question.
Well, I'm sorry, but I'm speaking from a Sinhalese perspective, which I think is a voice that is not being heard tonight. And I do have a lot I want to say in response to the things that you've said, and that the lovely people before have said, about this conflict and about the way that this discussion in particular has driven the civil war to be. So I don't have a question, but I have a big problem in response. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I said ask a question. If you haven't got a question, we'll move on to someone.
That's why I'm saying it.
Okay, good. Anyone else has a question?
This might be a naive question, but I wonder what the UN could have or should have done in that situation that could have helped.
I think there's quite a strong argument to make that the casualty data that you saw, Clay, describing being collected could have been made public much earlier. And they could have spoken out much more strongly about the little information that they did have. They had access to satellite imagery of the war zone. They had that triangulated casualty data. And much of the data we only discovered in an annex in a document leaked in 2011, or 12 actually. So, that information was sitting with the UN. And when you look at their internal investigation, you see there was quite a drive to suppress the information even at the time that it was collected. That a lot of UN officials really valued the relationship with the government more than their duty to protect.
Yes. And could they have done anything practical to help those people suffering starvation, etc.?
Well, the problem was the government didn't allow them access, and they had these food convoys and the odd ICRC ship that got in, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to need. So it was really a political problem of how much pressure they were willing to put on the government to open things up rather than not having enough trucks of food. Does that make sense?
Fine.
Have you seen any victim or sexually abused by LTT? Have you ever seen or have you ever heard?
The typical profile of the types of people the types of survivors who we see in Freedom from Torture, really sadly they tend to have been through multiple periods of torture at various points, And sometimes, that includes torture at the hands of LTTE at some point in the conflict. But it would be unfair not to point out that the majority of cases that we see, and I recognise that there are many cases that we don't see, but the majority of cases that we see are torture at the hands of the police and intelligence agencies.
And army.
And army, sorry, yeah.
I think his question was, do you see cases of sexual violence committed by the LTTE? I think that's what he was asking.
Yeah, so I mean, sexual torture and sexual violence are a significant part of most of the torture cases that we see. So where those people have faced multiple periods and on occasion they are at the hands of LTTE, there's not a significantly different profile for the treatment that they had at the hands of LTTE to the types of torture that we see now.
I mean, just to wrap it up, Professor Elizabeth Wood has done a lot of study on sexual violence in the LTT, and she chose the LTT because it's absent. That amongst all the armed groups that she studied as a professor of war, she's trying to explain why it doesn't happen in the case of the LTT, and you can look up her work.
Yeah, and that we would corroborate that too, that we haven't seen cases of sexual violence by the LTT. Though torture, there are some, but not anywhere near as many.
Okay. So I'm sorry, one question please, so we can have, I want to ask you, and then if anyone else wants to ask a question, put your hand up so I can line you up now. Okay, fine.
Sorry, I just want to know what the LTT is.
It's a good time to ask.
Sorry.
I want to let one of you answer that.
Liberation, the Tamil Tigers, it's the acronym for the full title.
So my
Question.
part of I will have to clear the point. That's why again and again I'm asking the question: why the UN didn't overcome all the things what happened in the last minute? Cluster bomb, which one is a phosphorus? It's well reserved, and the fire zone area they bombed it. These all have the evidence and everything. Why they didn't come out? Are you thinking like we don't have a leader or we don't have any government? That's why you have to support the government. Sri Lankan government. Which was the reason you didn't come over? What's the reason you have to manipulate with the government? You can see as a human and you can overcome. You are the neutral expert in me. You have to come out. Why you people have to think? I have to finish the question, please. Why you have to think about the things and you neutralize the things? You can. You have the evidence and you have the satellite proof and everything. Why you have to wait? 7 years now.
I mean, I would like to know why they were not more outspoken too, so I share your frustration, I think. But and I think that, to be fair, the internal inquiry that looks at the UN's failures is pretty damning. And then, of course, there's been a UN inquiry into the war itself, the period before and after the war as well, which was published in 2015, which is, not read by many people because it's vastly long, but it is, pretty shocking reading. It talks about systematic and widespread torture and rape post-war, and it talks about a policy, sanctioned from a high level of sexual violence, for example, against, Tamil detainees. So it's pretty damning, and it does look, to a certain extent, at some of the issues we're looking at. So there's been some soul-searching by the UN afterwards, but whether it would happen again, I mean, I wouldn't like to say it wouldn't happen again.
Would you like to say something?
I mean, I think it's sort of in any conflict situation, it's these sorts of questions afterwards that we will have a duty, and certainly we have a duty as advocates to raise and ask why the system failed and why it didn't protect people. And there are a multitude of reasons that you could use as excuses for that, not least the absolute monolith that is the UN, and trying to get any change is a horrific thing to try and achieve. But they're excuses. I mean, the UN is there to protect people, and every time it fails, it should be questioned what exactly went wrong and how on earth are you going to stop this from happening in the future.
But to be fair, member states were not advocating for putting pressure at all at that point. So, I mean, actually, as the play says, the Norwegians were the only ones who were really still involved and kind of, in a way, aware of what was going to happen. I mean, I have to say, I watched the war from outside, and from about December 2008 onwards, it was pretty obvious what was going to happen, right? I mean, you watched it too. We all knew that once the Tigers lost Kilinochi, that basically it was, a very small area of land that had been pushed into the sea. So there really was no way to come back from that. And, the international community as a whole turned a blind eye, didn't care, sold off on it, for all sorts of very complicated reasons.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, give me a moment. I mean, it's worth noting that the UN, we say the UN like it's some magical kingdom far away. The UN is an organization of member states. So in other words, the reason the UN doesn't do anything is because the major states involved, and I would start with the US and the UK as two permanent members of the Security Council, in this particular case are the leading states, were A, not that interested on the humanitarian crisis, and B, were pretty much backing the war anyway, and they had been since at least the mid-90s in a very systematic way to defeat terrorism. The problem in that particular moment, it's worth thinking what 2009 January to May is about, and that's the moment when we transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration in the US. And that's the time at which Sri Lanka goes nuts. Wait. Let me just clarify. And that means that if we don't push British and American and other major states to act, we can't say the UN does not act. The UN acts when major states act. And I think that leads, the reason I'm pointing that is one of the things you can ask yourself at the end of today is tomorrow morning, what are you going to do? Right? What are you going to do? It's a question, because it's horrific, yes, but then if you do nothing, well, so what? And so people like Francis, people like Anne, who work on this every day, do try to make some kind of substantive change to stop the torture that's happening now and the torture that will continue to happen. So the question I think that I wanted to, I'll ask a few more, but I was going to save this for chair's privilege at the end, is what can ordinary people do now to change this? So, something on a more sort of active note.
I think from our perspective, it's about raising awareness of. It's very easy. Torture is a crime that is designed to remove people's voices and make them invisible. It's about terrifying you so that the one time you spoke out, or the time that you were in the wrong place, or you're of the wrong ethnicity, that you remember that, and that you don't put yourself in a political role, or you don't speak out again. And so when people have had their voices removed like that, it's the duty of everyone to help those people find their voice again, and for crimes like torture not to kind of just disappear into the ether. And just because people aren't speaking about it, there's an assumption a lot of the time that it's not happening. So I think we all have a duty to, where we know that in either an active conflict or a post-conflict, whatever that means, situation, that where human rights abuses are still happening, that there is a constant pressure on your government, on kind of your MP to, why aren't you asking questions in Parliament about this? You're going on a trade delegation to Sri Lanka, what are you asking about kind of human rights and ethical kind of trade as part of that delegation? Write to your MP, start kind of, talking about these violations and the fact that they are ongoing, and the fact that the end of conflict doesn't mean the end of kind of mistreatment for everyday people. The thing that's frightening about our clients is that they are really ordinary people. They are not high-profile members of LTTE. They're, wives of, my kind of brother's cousin was forcibly conscripted into LTTE, and then I came onto the police radar, and then I faced, years of torture as a result, and I've had to flee for my life. They're really ordinary people, and they could be any one of us.
Yeah, I would say they're ordinary people with extraordinary lives, and when I look at people beginning to come back from the torture, I wouldn't even dare to use the word recover, actually, but we run I run a very, very small charity, and we started doing English classes, which is for groups of Tamil, mostly men, but some women as well. And the classes, I mean, are about education, but they're really about bringing people together, getting them out of the house, having them socialise, you know, and they have to, when you look at them, they have to relearn everything, basically, social. So they have to relearn how to talk to other people, how to feel comfortable with them, how to eat, how to serve food, clear it up, work in teams together, how to talk. And we've had trouble, you know, you can't teach English to people in normal conversation because you can't say how many brothers and sisters do you have, because some of them are dead or disappeared. You can't say what village do you come from, because then that identifies people, and we have to leave an awful lot of, you know, normal chit-chat out of the room. And when you see people who've been through the most extraordinarily degrading kind of treatment, and I mean, I'm talking about really innovative and brutal torture that I wouldn't tell you about here because I don't think you really want to hear it. And you see them going through that, and you see them, you know, with scars and pains all over their body, and also the sexual violence, which is, you know, like, it's invisible and it's very difficult to document, and it's so devastating, and sexual violence against young boys and as well as women, and it's so sort of taboo and secret and difficult to cope with. When you see them coming back from that and actually having a day where they can laugh or celebrate someone's birthday, I mean, it is magic, and it is probably the only thing that keeps me going doing this, to see that people can actually put outside the room some of the horrific things that have happened to them. And it's really a triumph of the human spirit and strength. And so when we talk about victims and survivors and so on, we sort of don't want to, having a voice, and I didn't want to take their voice. I think we also have to think how strong those people are, that they can carry on living. It takes a huge, you know, act of courage to do that.
Or would you have suggestions for what people who might not have been active before or involved might do?
I don't know if I want to presume to tell other people what to do, but
well, advice. I mean, it's not telling people what to
well, you
do.
could help me with the charity, but it's very small. Or, I mean, you know, the Preventing Sexual Violence Minister is going to Sri Lanka quite soon, so, you know, it's worth writing to her, lobbying her. The UK is funding £6.5 million of security sector reform projects in Sri Lanka that don't seem to be prioritising torture, so that's obviously a big issue for us, because the security sector does need reforming, and that's good, and it would benefit everybody, Sinhalese, Tamils and Muslims, because there's a lot of torture that's not related to the LTT that's in police stations as well, to do with, you know, the way suspects of crimes are treated. So, you know, take more interest, I guess, ask questions from the government.
We've got 1 more minute.
Can I ask something? Sorry. Have you used organisations like Avaz? You know, Avaz collecting, you have, I just haven't noticed.
Yeah, I mean, so Freedom from Torture is, we haven't been a campaigning organisation for a while. We've focused really on our kind of rehabilitation and advocacy work, but we're starting to look at, you know, how we might partner with other organisations like Avaz and kind of increase reach.
Okay. Christine's
So
going
yeah,
to
unfortunately we have to evacuate, get out of this space. But you know, the bar will be open for another